The sun hung high over Arlington National Cemetery, casting a warm golden light across the marble paths and green lawns. The air was quiet, so still that even the sound of footsteps seemed out of place. Visitors stood silently, their eyes fixed on the tomb of the unknown soldier, a place that held deep meaning for everyone who came. The tomb guards walked in precise steps, their movements sharp and steady, their faces unreadable. Every action was done with honor and purpose. Among the crowd that day stood Jake Donovan, a man whose name once filled stadiums. He was a world boxing champion, famous for his lightning-fast punches and loud personality. Though retired now, Jake still carried himself like a fighter, broad shoulders, confident stride, and that unshakable look of someone used to winning. His career had made him rich and admired, but also a bit proud. He liked being the toughest man in the room. Jake had come to Arlington with a few friends while visiting Washington, D.C. They had toured museums, taken photos, and laughed through most of the day. When they arrived at the tomb, Jake was impressed at first by the ceremony. The guard moved like a machine, perfect posture, every turn timed to the second. But as minutes passed, Jake's natural confidence took over. He whispered to his friend Mark, "They look strong, but too stiff. You put one of them in the ring with me, I'd drop him in a round." Mark chuckled quietly, thinking Jake was just joking, but the people standing nearby heard him. A few turned to look, their expressions showing clear disapproval. To them, the tomb wasn't a place for jokes, it was sacred ground. Yet Jake, not realizing how serious it was, smirked and crossed his arms. One elderly veteran, wearing a cap that read Korean War, stepped a little closer and said softly, "Son, these men aren't just guards. They're chosen from the best. They stand out here in heat and rain, day and night. No matter what happens, they never move until it's time." Jake nodded politely but didn't seem convinced. "Still," he said with a half grin, "I've seen tough men before. I'm just saying, if this were a ring..." The veteran didn't answer. He simply turned back toward the tomb, shaking his head slightly. The ceremony continued, and the guard, Staff Sergeant Miller, walked with steady steps. His face never changed expression. His uniform was perfect, boots polished until they shone, and his rifle rested at his side with precision. Every turn, every click of his heel echoed with authority, but Jake's playful attitude hadn't gone unnoticed. A few people began whispering, some recorded on their phones, wondering if the famous boxer might actually do something foolish. Jake felt the eyes on him and his pride grew stronger. He wasn't trying to be disrespectful, at least not in his mind. He just thought it was all too formal. "Man, I could teach that soldier some real movement," he joked, lightly shadowboxing in the air. A couple of tourists nearby gasped quietly. The guard continued walking, completely focused. But when Jake's shadowboxing brought him too close to the low rope that marked the line, "Visitors must not cross," tension filled the air. The sound of the guard's steps stopped. The silence was heavy. Everyone could feel it. Miller turned sharply, his rifle held firmly in his white-gloved hands. His boots clicked against the stone as he faced the crowd. His eyes, calm yet strong, locked directly on Jake. The boxer froze. For the first time that day, he felt a chill run down his spine. The guard spoke in a deep, controlled voice that carried across the open space. "It is requested that you remain behind the barrier." Those words weren't loud, but they were powerful. The sound echoed off the marble walls like thunder in the still air. The entire crowd fell silent. Even Jake's friends stood still, not daring to move. For a moment, Jake didn't know what to say. He had faced thousands of fighters, stared into eyes filled with aggression, but this was different. The soldier's stare wasn't angry. It was calm, steady, and full of purpose. It was the look of someone who stood not for himself, but for something far greater. Jake raised his hands a little, as if in peace. All right, no harm meant," he said softly with a half smile. But his voice didn't carry the same pride it did before. It sounded smaller, respectful even. The guard gave no reply. He simply turned back to his post, lifted his rifle, and resumed his measured steps. The rhythm of his boots echoed once more, perfectly timed, perfectly disciplined. It was as if nothing had happened. Jake stood there for a few seconds watching. Something inside him changed. The playful grin was gone. His chest felt heavy with realization. This wasn't a show. It was a promise, a duty carried out with absolute respect. Mark leaned toward him and whispered, "Maybe we should go." Jake nodded slowly. "Yeah," he said quietly, his eyes still fixed on the guard. "He's tougher than he looks." The veteran from earlier glanced back at Jake and gave him a small nod. There was no anger in his eyes, only understanding. Jake returned the nod with respect, feeling a strange sense of humility wash over him. As they walked away, Jake kept glancing back. The guard hadn't moved from his line, hadn't lost his focus, hadn't broken his silence. Every step he took was a reminder that strength wasn't just about power. It was about discipline, control, and respect. That night, back at his hotel, Jake couldn't stop thinking about it. For the first time in years, he felt as if he had met someone stronger than himself. Not physically, but in spirit. He realized that while he had spent his life fighting opponents in a ring, that soldier faced something far greater every day, the weight of representing every unknown hero who never came home. Jake lay awake for a long time, staring at the ceiling. He didn't feel embarrassed, just thoughtful. Somewhere deep inside, he knew he had been taught a lesson without being hit once. It was as if life had shown him that real victory didn't always come from fists. It came from honor. And though he didn't know it yet, the moment that began with pride would soon lead to one of the most humbling experiences of his life. An experience that would stay with him forever. The morning after his visit to Arlington, Jake Donovan couldn't stop thinking about what had happened at the tomb of the unknown soldier. The image of Staff Sergeant Miller standing tall and unflinching haunted him. Jake had been a world champion, someone used to facing fear and testing limits, yet he felt something entirely different that day. It was a mixture of awe, respect, and a strange, humbling feeling he had never experienced inside a boxing ring. Determined to understand it better, Jake decided to return the next day. He wanted to see the ceremony again, to watch the guard move with that perfect discipline and maybe, just maybe, understand how a person could hold such power without ever throwing a punch. As Jake arrived, he noticed that the crowd was slightly larger than the previous day. Families, veterans, and tourists had come from near and far to witness the silent precision of the tomb guard. Jake walked slowly along the barrier this time, careful not to cross the line, but his presence naturally drew attention. Whispers spread quickly. "Is that really the boxing champion?" And a few cameras discreetly recorded him. Jake waved politely at those who recognized him, though his mind wasn't on the attention. Miller was already on post, walking his measured steps with a calm, steady rhythm. Jake studied every motion, the sharp turn, the heel click, the way his uniform stayed perfect despite the heat of the sun. There was a quiet strength in the soldier's movements, something far more powerful than any punch. Jake felt a surge of admiration. He realized that this man had trained not for glory or fame, but for respect and honor, standing as a guardian for soldiers who could no longer speak for themselves. Jake's thoughts wandered to his own boxing career. He had faced the toughest opponents in the world, but this challenge was unlike anything he had encountered. No arena, no ropes, no cheering crowd, just silent discipline and a presence that demanded respect. For the first time, he wondered if true strength might not be measured in punches or victories, but in control, patience, and purpose. Suddenly, a small boy ran close to the barrier, tugging at his mother's hand. "Mom, he looks strong," the boy said, pointing at the guard. Jake smiled. Even children could feel the power of discipline. He realized that the guard's silent strength was teaching lessons without saying a word, lessons that people of all ages could understand. Jake's admiration grew, but so did his curiosity. He wanted to know more about the man behind the uniform. He watched as Miller completed his turn, the rifle resting carefully against his shoulder. Every motion seemed deliberate yet effortless. Jake wondered how long it took to master such skill, to carry out a task with perfect precision day after day. He thought about the years of training he had spent in boxing, hours, sweat, and pain, and he realized that this soldier's training was different but no less demanding. He remembered the brief moment from the day before, when Miller had stopped him without raising a hand. The memory sent a shiver down his spine. In boxing, he had faced fear, tension, and pressure, but never respect that humbled him so completely. He realized that Miller had defeated him in a single round, not with punches, but with his presence, his discipline, and the sheer weight of his responsibility. As Jake watched, he noticed the careful attention of the crowd. Everyone seemed aware of the sacredness of the place. Some visitors whispered quietly, while others held cameras with reverence. The silence added to the weight of the moment. Jake understood that here there were no distractions, no shouting, no cheering, no flash of lights. Every eye, every step, every breath was part of a lesson in honor. Jake began talking quietly with a few veterans who had gathered nearby. They told him stories about the tomb guards, about how difficult it was to earn the position, how every guard went through weeks of training that tested their focus, patience, and physical endurance. "You can have the strongest body," one veteran explained, "but if your mind isn't ready, you won't survive a single shift here." Jake listened carefully, absorbing every word. The crowd noticed Jake's genuine interest, and a few people even smiled at the change in his demeanor. He wasn't the confident, joking fighter from yesterday. He was thoughtful, respectful, and attentive. Some visitors quietly whispered, "Even the boxing champion is learning today." Suddenly, a tourist dropped a bag near the rope, accidentally stepping a little too close. Without breaking his rhythm, Miller stopped, glanced at the bag, and gently signaled to the tourist to move back. The action was calm, controlled, and firm. Jake felt a deep respect for the small, silent correction. It was not an act of anger, but of responsibility. Every gesture carried weight. Jake decided to sit quietly on a nearby bench and watch the ceremony for the rest of the morning. He noticed the way Miller's uniform stayed perfect, how his rifle never wavered, and how each turn was timed with exact precision. Time seemed to slow down. Every click of Miller's boots against the marble sounded louder than the bustling city beyond the cemetery walls. Jake realized that this soldier had mastered control over himself, over his movements, and over the emotions of everyone watching. As the morning went on, Jake felt something changing inside him. His pride as a fighter slowly softened into admiration. He understood that Miller's power wasn't about physical strength. It was about dedication, patience, and responsibility. He felt humbled, as if he had entered a world where victories weren't measured in trophies, but in the quiet strength to honor others. By the time the ceremony ended, Jake walked slowly to the exit, pausing to nod respectfully at Miller. The guard returned the nod with perfect composure, acknowledging the gesture without a word. It was a silent conversation between two men, one who had fought in arenas around the world, and one who fought in a different kind of battle every day. Jake left Arlington that day with a new understanding. He realized that some victories could never be measured by punches or medals. Some victories were in quiet strength, discipline, and respect for duty. He felt as if he had been part of a lesson that could never be forgotten, a lesson that would stay with him forever. That night, back in his hotel room, Jake reflected on the day. He remembered the small boy pointing, the tourists stepping too close, the veterans sharing their stories, and most of all, the calm, unshakable presence of Staff Sergeant Miller. It was clear to him that true power didn't always show itself in speed or force. It showed itself in honor, patience, and the courage to stand for something bigger than oneself. Jake smiled quietly to himself, thinking, "I've been knocked out before, but never like this." He felt humbled, inspired, and determined to carry this lesson with him. In his heart, he knew that someday, when people asked him about true strength, he wouldn't talk about boxing. He would talk about a soldier who could KO a champion without even throwing a punch, a man who taught the world that some battles are won with silence and discipline, not fists. The days that followed Jake Donovan's visit to Arlington were quiet, but in his mind they were full of reflection. He couldn't stop replaying the moments with Staff Sergeant Miller. Every step, every turn, every measured breath of the guard seemed to echo in his thoughts. Jake, a man used to loud arenas, roaring crowds, and flashing cameras, had never felt a silence so powerful. He realized that this was a victory of a different kind, a victory not of fists but of spirit. Jake decided he wanted to honor what he had learned. He began telling friends, family, and even journalists about the experience. He described how a single soldier could command attention, respect, and humility without striking a single blow. Jake said, "I thought I was strong. I thought I knew strength. But I was wrong. That guard, he showed me what true power really is." One afternoon, Jake returned to Arlington once more. This time, he wanted to experience it fully, not as a champion seeking thrill, but as a learner seeking understanding. As he approached the tomb, the familiar hush greeted him. Tourists and veterans alike glanced toward him, recognizing him from his previous visits. He nodded quietly, feeling a new kind of pride, not the pride of victory, but the pride of respect. Miller was on post, as always, moving with perfect precision. Jake watched every motion, every click of his polished boots, every sharp turn. He noticed something he hadn't before. The quiet discipline wasn't just physical. It was mental, emotional, and spiritual. The guard carried the weight of history, honor, and memory with a calm that Jake found almost impossible to achieve in his own life. A small crowd had gathered as usual, and a few children pointed excitedly. "Look, he's so strong," one whispered. Jake smiled, realizing that strength could inspire without aggression. He watched Miller maintain focus, and it struck him that the soldier was not just protecting a tomb. He was protecting the memory of countless lives, sacrifices, and stories that could never be told. Jake began walking along the barrier, careful not to overstep, and felt a sudden urge to speak to Miller. But he realized that words might ruin the moment. Instead, he simply nodded in deep respect. The guard's eyes briefly met his, and for a fraction of a second, a silent understanding passed between them. It was as if Miller recognized that Jake had changed, that he no longer sought to test but to learn. Later, Jake met a group of veterans near the cemetery benches. They shared stories of soldiers long gone, and Jake listened with rapt attention. For the first time, he saw how true bravery was often quiet, unseen, and uncelebrated. These were not men seeking fame. They were men who stood firm when it mattered most, men who taught lessons through action rather than words. Jake reflected on his own boxing career. He had faced fear, pain, and danger in the ring, but he realized that none of it compared to the weight of responsibility carried by Miller and the other tomb guards. In the ring, victory was measured by points and knockouts. Here, victory was measured by honor, dedication, and the ability to remain unwavering under constant pressure. The experience began to change Jake in ways he had not expected. He found himself practicing patience, observing more carefully, and thinking deeply about respect and responsibility. He began sharing these lessons publicly, saying, "Strength isn't just about winning fights. It's about standing for something greater than yourself, even when no one is watching." One afternoon, as Jake watched Miller complete another flawless ceremony, he noticed a small detail he had missed before. The guard's eyes, though calm, scanned the area with alertness. Every motion was deliberate, yet every gesture seemed effortless. Jake realized that Miller's discipline was the result of years of unseen effort, of countless hours of training, focus, and self-control. It was a reminder that greatness often comes quietly, without applause or recognition. Over time, Jake's admiration for the tomb guard turned into a mission. He began speaking at schools, community events, and veterans programs about the experience. He told stories of the soldier who could KO a champion without a punch, emphasizing that true strength is respect, discipline, and courage in the face of responsibility. Children, adults, and veterans alike listened intently, inspired by the lesson of humility and honor. Jake also noticed the ripple effect his stories had on others. People began visiting Arlington with a deeper understanding, more respectful of the guards and the sacredness of the place. They learned that strength is not always visible, and that sometimes the most powerful lessons are taught in silence. Months later, Jake returned one final time before leaving Washington. He approached the tomb with reverence, his steps slow and careful. Miller was on post, and as Jake stood quietly behind the barrier, he felt an overwhelming sense of gratitude. The guard's presence, silent yet commanding, reminded him of the day his pride was humbled, the day he truly understood what it meant to be strong. Jake bowed his head slightly, a gesture of deep respect. Miller nodded in return, acknowledging not just the visitor but the understanding that had been reached without a word. In that moment, Jake felt a sense of completion. He had come seeking curiosity, found humility, and left with wisdom. He realized that the greatest victories often leave no scars, no trophies, no headlines, only lasting lessons in the heart. On the plane back home, Jake reflected on the journey. He smiled to himself, thinking about how a single encounter had reshaped his idea of strength. The memory of Staff Sergeant Miller, standing firm and disciplined, would remain with him forever. He knew that whenever he faced challenges in life, personal, professional, or emotional, he could draw on the lesson of the tomb guard, that true courage, true strength, and true honor are shown not through fists, but through patience, respect, and unwavering dedication to a greater purpose. Jake Donovan, the boxing champion, had been knocked out in one round not by a punch, but by the silent power of honor and discipline. And in that knockout, he found something far more valuable than any championship belt, a lesson that would shape the rest of his life. From that day forward, Jake carried the story with pride, not as a tale of confrontation, but as a story of learning, growth, and respect. He shared it widely, hoping to inspire others to understand that true heroes don't always fight. They stand, quietly, steadfastly, and with purpose. And so, the boxing champion who thought he knew strength learned the greatest lesson of all, that sometimes the strongest person in the room is the one who doesn't move for glory, the one who doesn't raise a hand, the one who simply stands for what is right.